one's beyond redemption and hope springs eternal, but we should work where we are in our communities and in our states to keep improving criminal justice from a conservative perspective. That is so important. We need to own this issue if it's going to be done right. The left can't own it. We got to own it.
Former Virginia Attorney General Ken Cuccinelli at this year's CPAC advocating conservative criminal justice reform. Advocates like Cuccinelli urge that the tough on crime policies that came into being in the 80s and 90s are very much in need of reform. So what needs to be done in the House and Senate to enact conservative criminal justice reform? Let's discuss that now with a good friend of this program, Skyping in once again from New Jersey, former New York Police Commissioner Bernard Kerik. Bernie, of course, also the author of the book, From Jailer to Jailed. Bernie, before we get to the topic of criminal justice reform, we've been overtaken by events. Breaking news today that Belgian authorities have rolled up a bunch of terror suspects, including the mastermind of that Paris attack. It appears this is a big day in Belgium.
Well, listen, this is as a result, I think, of a lot of intelligence that they have accumulated over the last several weeks. And hopefully, if they can keep the mastermind alive, I understand he's been wounded, shot and wounded. If they can keep him alive, I think they may get a lot more intelligence out of him over time. That's why it's so important that we have constant communications between local, state, and federal officials, between our international partners abroad, especially in the European nations. It's extremely important. That's how they got this group, and that's how they'll continue to get more. We've got to fight this fight in the Middle East, where ISIS is headquartered, but you're going to have to fight the guys that are here, that are coming in, that are born here, and this is a part of that.
And obviously it is a topic we will pursue as events warrant. We thank you for your quick take on that breaking news today. Now let's get back to the topic at hand. And as we heard Ken Cuccinelli make the case at CPAC for conservative criminal justice reform, I thought back to an area of reform that we worked on when I first went to Congress. Henry Hyde, chairing the Judiciary Committee, very strong conservative. John Conyers of Michigan, very liberal, the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee, coming together for reform of the RICO statutes. Do you think we can see the left and right join for criminal justice reform on Capitol Hill?
You know what, JD, you know a lot of these guys a lot better than I do, but Mr. Conyers, who is there now, Sensenbrenner, they are joined at the hip almost these days at putting together some crime legislation, criminal justice reform legislation that has some real movement. And Senator Grassley, Mike Lee, and a few others, they are doing the same thing. Hopefully, they can all come together, both the right and left, work at a bill. A few of these bills, I think they can join together, looking at the mandatory minimums, looking at overcriminalization, mens rea, putting criminal intent back into the law, some of the conspiracy laws. Hopefully they can look at these things and make the reforms needed to make the system better.
You mentioned some of the luminaries on Capitol Hill, and one of the names you mentioned most recently was Senator Mike Lee. I want to get to that in a second, but I also want to talk about some of the states that have been working on this. And we've seen states with conservative governors like Texas. Rick Perry going to work down in Austin to get that done. Do you think people are surprised when they hear that Texas has undertaken this kind of reform? And why haven't we seen it in other so-called liberal states like New York?
You know what, JD, as I talk around the country, I constantly praise Texas and what Governor Perry did in Texas. You know, he looked at the mandatory minimum issues. He looked at alternatives to incarceration. They closed down some of their prisons in Texas. They're having people in prison for less amounts of time, and they're still reducing crime in general, violent crime. And what I tell people around the country is if Texas can do it, then the rest of the country can do it. The rest of the states can do it. Most importantly, the federal government should do it. You know, these states, they have to do it because it's all about money. You can't continue to incarcerate people at the levels we are because eventually you'll run out of money. Unfortunately, the federal government prints money. They make their own, so it doesn't mean anything to them. That doesn't mean it's right. In fact, it's completely wrong. There's a lot they have to do with the federal criminal justice system, but I think they should be looking at the states in general to see the progress they're making. And in places like New York, you know, a lot of the conservatives, the ones that are out there that are anti-reform, they say, you know, we got to keep people in prison longer. Well, we reduced the Rockefeller drug laws in New York City, New York State, and crime continued to drop in New York State. So that's, you know, this thing they have, put them in prison and lock them up and throw away the key. That's just not working anymore.
I mentioned the name Mike Lee, as you did earlier, Bernie, and we should note in closing that Senator Lee believes this next Supreme Court appointment, whenever it happens, maybe not with President Obama's nominee, but with the next president, he believes that will be a perfect time to highlight this kind of criminal justice reform. So we will see. In the meantime, Bernard Kerik tonight from New Jersey. Bernie, you have our thanks. You heard what Bernie had to say. Agree or disagree? Why don't you send me your comments at newsmaxtv.com/comments. We'll have more after this.